These are 10 must-have items in every construction contract. If you don't see these items, you're likely playing with fire. If you don't see this in your construction contract, run. Scope of work. This is where the actual activities of the work are described. The language should be quite specific. It shouldn't be vague. This is often where a lot of disputes and discrepancies happen. And if activities are not specifically mentioned, then they are legally not required to happen, no matter what they have said verbally. Is it a supply-only contract? Is it an install-only contract? Is it a supply and install contract? All of this should be laid out explicitly so that it's in black and white. And unfortunately, gaps in scope of work are the hardest to spot without experience. If you have any questions about scope of work and how to spot scope gaps, then get a hold of me at albatrossacademy.ca. So the payment schedule clause is going to outline exactly how the general contractor is getting paid and the schedule at which they are getting paid. So my preference is a project milestone-based schedule. So that would be for a new build, it might be at framing, at lockup, at foundations, maybe mechanicals, and at project conclusion. Now, when you have a project milestone-based schedule, everybody knows roughly how much each draw is going to be, and you also know when they're going to be. If you have maybe a monthly schedule, that's okay too, but the worst yet is having no schedule at all. And the contractor just says, well, I'll ask you when I need money. And that's not cool for a number of reasons. For one, it allows the budget to get a little bit out of control when there's no accountability. But also, the contractor can ask for as much money as they want, whenever they want. And the one thing that clients have when they're entering into these agreements, they have leverage, they have money. But when they pay the money up front, when they pay too much too soon, they start to lose the leverage. And so contractors they start taking longer, or the work starts to slip, or worse yet, the contractors start to screw off whenever they want, and sometimes they don't come back. And the customers say, well, why did they do this? Why did they do this? Because the customer has lost all of their leverage by paying too much too soon. So this project payment schedule helps to avoid that. So timelines and delays, and this is the first place in a construction contract where we're mentioning the schedule and the set schedule. Now, normally in a construction contract, you've got a start date and an end date that are laid out, but what happens, we need to know what happens if that process gets dragged out, especially if it's at fault of the contractor. We need to know what happens if things drag out, what happens, who's paying for the ongoing overhead of that project while things are delayed. We need these processes in place so that if that does happen, we have a process to follow. A lien waiver. So let's say you're paying the general contractor. You're paying the general contractor all of the invoices and all the draws that they're asking for, and it's the general contractor's responsibility under the contract to pay the subcontractors. What happens if the general contractor doesn't pay the subcontractors? You've paid them in full, so you've done nothing wrong, but the only recourse that a subcontractor has is to file a lien on the property. A lien on the property is a legal tag that goes on the title of the building that prevents the building from being, or the property rather, from being sold. It prevents it from being borrowed against, and in some jurisdictions, the city won't even allow you to pay the property taxes. And if there's an outstanding lien on the property. So it's an incentive for the homeowner to financially get things right with the subcontractors. You may be saying to yourself, well, this isn't my fault. I paid all of the invoices that the general contractor asked me to. It's not my fault that the general contractor didn't pay the subs, and you'd be right. So what a lien waiver does is it waives the right of the general contractor and the subcontractors to file a lien on the property for non-payment. So it protects the homeowner from having an unfair lien placed on the property. Warranty coverage. Now this is especially important in new builds. We need to understand what's the warranty like on water ingress, on the structure, on the mechanicals. Now, depending on where you live in your area, there are going to be licensed builders that carry specific warranties that are legislated by the provincial or the state legislature. But it's still important to separately, as a homeowner, to do your homework and understand what warranties should be available to you. It's also important to understand that in the renovation world, there's often no warranties available that are legislated. So it may depend on what the contractor themselves are willing to carry. Insurance and permits. Generally speaking, this clause ensures that the contractors carry correct and the valid insurance or risk of being in breach of contract if they don't. Usually, I suggest that the homeowners take out the building permit themselves. It takes it out of the builder's scope and can usually save them thousands of dollars in fees. This next contract clause is something that people don't really think about because it's, quite frankly, a little bit uncomfortable to think about, and that's dispute resolution. What we're looking for here is the outline of a process, because just going to court is just not good enough. Nobody wins when you go to court. What we're looking for here is a process of meeting, of negotiation, of mediation, and then maybe arbitration. If there is no process outlined and then you get into a construction dispute, it's the Wild West of threats and tactics and bullying and he said, she said, and it just turns into a mess. If you have a process to lean on, this process gets so much easier and really, really well defined too. So a change order process clause in a contract. A change order, it should be noted, is when there's a material change in the existing construction contract, we need to make a contract amendment, and that results in a change order. So that's an official change to the contract. Say you're doing a new build and you want to add a bathroom or something. That's going to take more resources from the contractor, and the contractor is going to issue you a change order. But what ends up happening is that if there's no change order process in place, then you start getting on verbal agreements and things get really messy, especially when pricing is involved. So with the change order process, it's going to outline all changes must be in writing before they start. That's very, very important. It protects both the owner and the contractor. And the contract should specify how the contract changes are priced, because customers lose a bit of leverage when they ask contractors that are already halfway through the job to reprice something that has changed in the contract. The contractors essentially have the customer over a barrel, and they know that the customer is not going to go out and re-tender or rebid this portion of the contract if it's super small, like adding a bathroom or something like that. So the contractors can, if they're unscrupulous, they can actually overcharge for change orders. And some of them love it, and so they love vague contracts and they love ambiguous drawings. So that's something to watch out for. So change order process, an important clause to have in your contract. If you don't have this clause in your construction contract, you're asking for trouble. The contract termination clause outlines how this contract comes to an end. Now, ideally, your project would come to an end at the same time as the end of the contract, but sometimes that's not always the case. So we need outlines, we need some parameters to know if this project, or excuse me, if this contract is terminated prior to the end of the project, what does that look like? What are the requirements for contract termination versus a breach of contract? We need to understand what are acceptable terms for the end of this contract. What are the required notice periods for the end of this contract? How do we handle the money if the contract ends prematurely to the end of the project? We need to understand all of this so that when or if, ideally if or ideally not, it happens, we don't get stuck in this limbo where we have no idea what's actually going to happen and then we sort it out legally afterwards, because that's something no one wants. This contract clause is absolutely critical, but almost no one uses it. Final completion clause outlines the whole process of project completion. It answers some questions like, what is substantial completion? Now, generally, substantial completion is when the building is ready to be used, but there are still some outstanding items left to be finished. What is a holdback? When is a holdback released? So for your information, a holdback is usually a percentage of every bill, every draw that you're paying to the general contractor, you're holding back. It's usually about 10%. You're holding back as an incentive for the contractor to fully finish the project. So you're paying 90% of every draw, and the last 10% is held, sometimes in a joint bank account with the contractor, so that the contractor has a lot of meat on the bone, or they have some added incentive to finish the project. Now, normally the holdback is released after final completion, and that's when the contractor will apply and say, hey, can I have the rest of that holdback? And you'll notice that the project is now complete. This clause should also outline what needs to happen at final completion. Does the building inspector need to deem this finally complete? Does the engineer have to give you their final sign-off? Does the client need to do a walkthrough and deem it to be finally complete? The punch list, everything, all items are crossed off. So this is a really important process to have outlined, because if you don't, then when you get to the end of the project, the contractor is going to ask for the last straw, the last bit of money, and the client's going to say, oh, well, I guess, I don't know, should we just give it to him? And like, well, you don't really know. But when this process is outlined, then everything gets a lot more clear. I'm Aaron from Albatross Academy. If this video has been helpful for you, head over to YouTube and check out the full version of this video where I outline all 10 items of must-have items in a construction contract.